Hello students, this is Dr. Ways and welcome to your lecture on the heart. So again with the surface anatomy, but the good thing is we have gone through a lot of this before, so it should be pretty much review for you at this point. What I want you to notice first of all is that the base of the heart right here is mostly behind the sternum. And then the apex extends to the left side of the thoracic cavity. And we saw that with the lungs when there was that space that was there for the heart, and is the reason why we only have two lobes on the left side of our thoracic cavity. Also notice here that this is the pulmonary trunk just to the left side of the sternal border, and the pulmonary trunk comes out of the right ventricle. So that means that this part right here is right ventricle, which would make this right atrium. So the important thing to remember is that the right side of the heart is facing forward, all right, facing the anterior wall of the thoracic cavity. So, for example, if you have a stab wound right here in the 4th intercostal space, the first chamber of the heart you're going to enter is the right ventricle, right? And then the left side, of course, if the right is in the anterior side, the left ventricle would be mostly on the posterior side. And we're going to see that as we go through some of the lecture material later on. All right, we've discussed this before. We locate the sternal angle, go down, go across one, and that is your second rib, whether it be the right or the left. And as we go to the second intercostal space, on the left side and the right side, we can hear our first two heart sounds. On the right side, you'd be listening to the aortic valve, and that makes sense because the aorta is right there. And on the right side, we'd be listening to the pulmonary valve, and that makes sense because the pulmonary trunk is right there. All right, then if we go down to the third intercostal space, fourth intercostal space, fifth intercostal space, that's where we'll be able to hear our tricuspid valve. And remember, the tricuspid valve is on the right side of the heart, so listening to that here, remember we said the right side of the heart is on the anterior chest wall, so you'll be able to hear the tricuspid valve in the fifth intercostal space, left sternal border. And then if we go down to the midclavicular line, and so this is one of the first cases we'll see where we'll use that term midclavicular line, we see that we have this spot here that's called the point of maximal impulse. All right, and that should be the place where you hear the heart sounds the loudest. In addition, that is also where you will hear the mitral valve, and this makes sense because the left side of the heart's the stronger side because it has to pump against a greater resistance out to the body, and that's where the mitral valve is located. And so that strong contraction will produce a really loud sound as it closes that mitral valve. Another landmark you should be aware of is right here in the third intercostal space. That's something called Erb's point or second pulmonic. So it's another place to hear the pulmonary valve if you're not hearing what you want to hear from the second intercostal space, left sternal border. All right, and so these pictures are showing you where you would place the stethoscope in those positions. And again, it all depends on touching your patient, finding out where those landmarks are, and putting your stethoscope in the appropriate place. My cheat for this is I always know that the fifth intercostal space, midclavicular line, is going to be right around where the nipple is. And so locate the nipple right around in that area. You should be able to find the point of maximal impulse. But when you first start out, always safer to count the ribs, count the intercostal spaces, go to midclavicular line, listen for the heart. All right, and it's going to take some practice when you get into clinical correlations and your physical exam lab. You might go to that spot and you're like, I don't hear much of anything. So that's when you move your stethoscope around a little bit to get the appropriate spot. Remember, this is just an average, so everybody's anatomy might be slightly different from each other. So it just takes practice on where you want to put that stethoscope and listening for what you want to be listening for. Just like the lungs have a double layered sac surrounding it to prevent friction as the lungs are moving, so does a heart, and that is referred to as the pericardium. Peri meaning surrounding, cardium referring to the heart. So, even though it's a double layered sac, you actually have three parts to your pericardium. The first part you can see here in white is the fibrous pericardium, and that's a fibrous sac that is on the outside of the heart, very tough, very hard uh, to damage, and it forms a very protective layer for the rest of the cardiac structures. Inside of that, or in fact, it's actually the internal border of the fibrous pericardium, you will have the parietal pericardium. And remember, parietal means wall, so it's going to be the part of that double layered membrane that's facing outward, facing the thoracic wall or the walls of the mediastinum. And then you have this black interpleural space where you're going to have the serous fluid. And then directly on the heart, you're going to have the visceral pericardium. And remember, visceral means organ. In this case, it's a heart. So the pericardium that's on the heart itself. All right. And as the heart's moving around, of course, that pericardial structure provides a frictionless environment for the heart to move in so it doesn't cause damage to itself or the surrounding organs. All right, and like all structures in the body, the pericardium also has a blood supply and a nerve supply. So the nerve supply to the pericardial sac is comes from the right and left phrenic nerves. And remember what those phrenic nerves went to as well. That's right, the diaphragm down here. So the right and left phrenic nerves go to the pericardium of the heart as well as the diaphragm to produce contraction. But in the pericardium, of course, there's no muscle there, so they would be acting as pain receptors. They would be sensory specifically, not motor, whereas the one in the diaphragm would be mostly motor. All right, and the blood supply, you just like we saw with the diaphragm, you have the right and left pericardiochophrenic vessels. And this is where that cardio or cardia part makes sense. So not only does it go to the diaphragm and supply blood to the diaphragm, but it also supplies blood to the pericardial sac. Because again, that is live tissue and it needs a blood supply to stay alive. Now, if you were to take out the heart and leave the pericardial sac intact, you would notice that there is a sinus or an empty space, an open space behind the heart itself. That's formed by the reflection of the pulmonary veins of the onto the heart. So there, if you were to dig into a real cadaver, feel underneath, you'd be able to feel this little pocket. I'm sitting here doing this with my hands as if you guys can see what I'm doing, but feel this little pocket, and so that would be the oblique pericardial sinus. And then there's also the transverse pericardial sinus right here, and again, another space that will separate the arteries from the veins within the heart. All right, so this pericardial sac is not only performing the function of protection and resistance against friction, but it's also separating structures within the heart so that they stay as separate entities and don't cross over. Because when they do cross over, as in some congenital conditions, there are problems. All right, one of the big reasons why we want to understand what the anatomy of the pericardial sac is that under certain conditions, inflammatory conditions, fluid can build up in that pericardial sac. And remember, this pericardial sac is made up of fibrous connective tissue, and fibrous connective tissue does not give. It's pretty rigid. So if we have fluid building up within this pericardial sac, it's not going to bulge outward too much, but it's going to push the heart inward. And if it's pushing in on the muscular structure of the heart, that heart's not going to be able to contract as efficiently. And so that condition where we have an inflammatory process in the pericardial sac that's producing a lot of fluid is referred to as pericarditis, or literally inflammation of the pericardial sac. All right, and often the pericarditis can be mistaken for a myocardial infarction, otherwise known as a heart attack. And so, a couple of ways you can tell the difference between the two is that somebody with pericarditis will have continuous central chest pain, whereas myocardial infarction may come and go. But with the pericarditis, that can be relieved by sitting forward. If you sit forward when you're having a myocardial infarction, that pain will not be relieved. And then, of course, you can confirm that with an electrocardiogram, because you'll definitely see electrocardiograph changes when you have a heart attack versus pericarditis. And finally, the buildup of fluid in the pericardial sac is pericardial effusion. If it's a result of inflammation, the cause would be pericarditis. But if it's the result of bleeding or chest trauma filling up that pericardial sac, then it's not going to be pericarditis. So you can have pericardial effusion without having pericarditis, and that's going to depend on the cause of the pericardial effusion. Again, same thing. If you have fluid building up in that pericardial space around the heart, that's going to compress the heart and not allow it to contract and pump blood out to the rest of the body like it should. And again, the problem with this is it can be life-threatening. So something to watch out for as you get to further in your curriculum. All right, so as far as the anatomy of the heart goes, this is what you'll see with an external heart. All right, and this is a good picture right here with all of the fat and all of the extra tissue that would be on the heart stripped away so that you can strictly see the chambers, atria versus ventricles, and the great vessels that are coming out of or going into the heart. So right here and here, you will see the anterior side of the heart and all the structures that you can find from the outside. And here you will see the posterior view of the heart and all the structures on the outside. All of these structures are going to be on your list, list for lab that you need to find either in the anatomage table or in the models that we are providing. So I'm not going to go over any of the external heart here. We will cover that mostly in the lab. So if you want to get a head start reminding yourself what these structures are. Again, if you're looking at the heart straight on, you know that this right here is going to be the right ventricle, and this is going to be the right atrium. All right, and then if you look at the back of the heart or the posterior side, you know that that is going to be the left ventricle. All right, so that'll give you a good start. And if you already know that the pulmonary trunk is where blood gets pumped out from the right atrium, and the aorta is where it comes from the left, or I'm sorry, right ventricle, and the aorta is where the blood gets pumped from the left ventricle, you've already got yourself a good start. So just start reminding yourself about what these structures are, and you will definitely be finding them in lab and be responsible for identifying them in the laboratory as well. All right, now if we look at the inside or the internal structure of the right side of the heart, we're going to see some structures that you should be able to identify pretty readily. And these are going to be available on the model as well. And the anatomage table does a fairly good job of showing most of this. And I'll point out when we're in lab where it is going to be lacking. So what we have right here is the inside of the heart of the right side, the right atrium. And down here, we would have the right ventricle. And some structures I want to point out that are a little more detailed are, first of all, you have your musculi pectinati, which are little pectate muscles. So these are these little strands of muscles that you see all around. And up here you see something called your crista terminalis, which is a muscular ridge on the posterior side of the right atrium. So you can see the length of it right here, and you can see where it's going right here as well. All right, couple other structures. Here we have the fossa ovalis, and that is a vestigial structure from the times when you were a fetus where you had a hole between your left atrium and right atrium called the foramen ovale. And after you were born, this foramen ovale closed up, and you can still see the structure, and it's referred to as the fossa ovalis at this point. So that was a part where in fetal circulation where the blood from the right side of the heart could mix with the blood from the left side of the heart in the atria. Here you see the coronary sinus, where blood from the coronary circulation comes back into the heart, from the vessels that are surrounding the heart back into the inside of the heart to be pumped out again into pulmonary circulation. That's where that would be in the right atrium. And of course, then we have as we've talked about, the tricuspid valve, which is the valve that separates the right atrium from down here, which would be the right ventricle. In the right ventricle, we have these papillary muscles. All right, and these are muscles within the right ventricle that are connected to chordae tendineae, which are in turn connected to the flaps of the tricuspid valve. And when the ventricle contracts, these papillary muscles contract, pull on the chordae tendineae, and pull these valves shut so that when the ventricles are contracting and pushing blood through in this case, the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk, that blood is not flowing backward into the right atrium. So again, blood is only designed to flow in one direction. And if you have it start flowing backwards, of course, then you're going to have problems with your circulatory system. All right, and one final structure you'll see are these trabeculae carneae, which are basically just cords of muscle that are interlaced with one another. Trabecula means a lattice, so kind of a lattice work of muscle within the walls of the ventricle. In the left heart, you'll see very similar structures: papillary muscles, trabeculae carneae, chordae tendineae, but instead of the tricuspid valve, you have the bicuspid or two valves, or otherwise known as the mitral valve. All right, the other thing you want to notice in the left ventricle is that the walls of the ventricles are very thick, especially relative to the right ventricle. And the reason for this, of course, is that the left ventricle has to pump blood against a high resistance to the entire body, whereas the right ventricle only has to pump against a relatively small resistance just to the lungs. So you need a lot more muscle power in order to achieve that. This right here is a picture from your anatomage table that I took last summer, and it's not a very good picture, so go ahead and ignore that for now. We'll see better images once we get into the lab and look at the heart. But what else I do want to point out here is in the left atrium, we can also see the foramen ovale, and we can see the valve from the foramen ovale as well. Remember, this now is the fossa ovale, and the valve from the foramen ovale. It was a one-way valve, so it allowed blood to flow from the right atrium to the left atrium, but not back the other way. And then when that closed, the valve still remained, even though there was no flow of blood from the right atrium to the left atrium anymore. The other thing that you should be able to find in the internal structure of the heart are the valves. All right, and you have 4 valves in your heart. 2 of them are atrioventricular, or AV valves, and we saw those in the previous slides. Those are your bicuspid and tricuspid valves, or your mitral and tricuspid valves. If it's the tricuspid valve, it's between your right atrium and right ventricle. If it's the bicuspid valve, it's between your left atrium and left ventricle. And so you can see these valves right here. This would be 1, 2, 3. So that would be your tricuspid valve. And here you have 1, 2. That would be your bicuspid valve. All right, and remember, those are closed by the ventricles contracting, papillary muscles contracting, pulling on chordae tendineae, which pulls these valves shut. It always reminds me of that game you played when you were a kid where you had a bunch of kids standing around a parachute, and you pulled the parachute up and then pulled it down. That's kind of how the bicuspid and tricuspid valves work. Now, the other valves are two semi-lunar valves. All right, go back real quick. The atrioventricular valves, their job is to prevent backflow from the ventricles to the atria when the ventricles are contracting. The semilunar valves are the valves between the ventricles and the major blood vessels that they pump to. So they're called semilunar because they have this semi-moon lunar shape right here. Right, these little cusps, and you notice these cusps are kind of flappy and they're not attached to any kind of cords or muscles. So here's how they work. If you have a blood, the ventricle is contracting, pushing blood up this way, it's going to push that valve open. But then when the ventricles relax, blood's going to flow backwards and fill these cusps. And as it fills these cusps, the valve is going to close. All right, so what that does is it prevents the backflow of blood from the aorta and the pulmonary trunk back into the ventricles as the ventricles are relaxing, so that blood can go from the atria to the ventricles and refill. All right. The semilunar valves are your pulmonary, which is between your right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and your aortic, which is between your left ventricle and the aorta. All right. So they both work the same way. This would be right here. This would be left here. They both work the same way by when the ventricle is relaxing, blood filling up those cusps and closing them off. All right. You see here, this would be the pulmonary valve right here. This would be the aortic valve. And you notice there's three cusps. You have the anterior, which means it's facing the anterior of the heart. So this is what you would see coming from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. And remember, we can see that through the, we saw that before when we looked at the surface anatomy of the heart. The right ventricle is in the anterior portion of the heart facing the thoracic wall, anterior thoracic wall. All right, and then you have the left side and the right side. Okay, so here we're looking from the top down. All right, we're looking into the heart. This right here, right in the middle, notice that the aortic valve is right between all the other valves, the pulmonary, the bicuspid, and the tricuspid. And so there's a left, right, and a posterior, since that flat face is the posterior of the heart. Now, the interesting thing about the aortic valve, and I drew these little openings, these little blue openings right here, and you can see it right here, is that there are little openings in the left and right valves for the coronary vessels that they go to. All right, so that opening in the right side is the opening for the right coronary artery, and the opening in the left valve is the opening for the left coronary artery. So again, interesting, what happens is that when a ventricle is contracting and pushes blood through, blood's going into the aorta, but then when the ventricles relax and the blood flows backwards and these valves snap shut, blood is diverted into these openings for the coronary arteries, and that's how the coronary arteries are getting their blood supply. I'm so mad. So if you look in your lecture notes, there is an entire picture missing from this slide. So I'll do my best to draw it in as you see it in your uh, lecture notes. So these are the layers of the heart wall. So we've talked about the heart, the structures that are in the heart, and there's external structures that you guys need to know from lab and so on. But what does the heart wall itself look like? So let me finish drawing this here. You have multiple layers, and I'm not a very good artist, so please forgive me. And I'll try to use different colors to highlight the different parts that we want to be looking at. All right, so the first layer you see right here the outermost layer, that's going to be your fibrous pericardium. All right. And we've talked about that as being part of the pericardium. That's that very outside that's connected to all of the surrounding tissue, and it's very tough to allow for protection of the heart. So that would be this whole area here. All right. The second area would be our parietal pericardium. All right. Remember, that's on the underside of the uh, fibrous pericardium. All right, and it's connected to basically the outside of the heart, the walls of the mediastinum. All right, so that's your uh, parietal pericardium. Then we have our uh, space filled with um, serous fluid, all right, our pericardial cavity that's filled with serous fluid. And then we have our next layer, all right, and remember this next layer was called the visceral pericardium. Visceral pericardium. You remember, visceral means organ, so this is the pericardium that's also attached to the surface of the heart. All right. The visceral pericardium is also known as the epicardium. All right. So the visceral pericardium and the epicardium are the same thing. All right. They just have two different names depending on how you're talking about it. If you're talking about the pericardium, then it's going to be the visceral pericardium. If you're talking about the walls of the actual heart itself, then it's going to be called the epicardium. All right. So since we're talking about the walls of the heart itself, this epicardium is a very thin layer on the outside of the heart. And then this big green layer right here is the myocardium. Myo means muscle. So this is the muscle of the heart. This is the one that's at the actual business end of the heart. It's what does all the contracting in the left ventricle, right ventricle, and the atria that allows for the movement of blood. All right. So that is your uh, myocardium. And then finally, on the very inside, very thin layer attached to the inside of the um, myocardium. And it's what gives the heart, you can see here, that very shiny appearance. That is going to be the endocardium. All right, endo meaning inside. So it's a smooth, shiny surface that provides a frictionless surface for blood to pass across. And the reason why and it's continuous with the endothelial layer of blood vessels. And the reason why you want to have a smooth, shiny surface is that you want to keep blood flow as non-turbulent as possible, because as soon as you start making turbulent blood flow, you run the risk of clotting factors starting to become activated. So you want a very smooth laminar flow across a smooth surface to prevent blood clotting and blood moving in one direction. All right, so I know it's kind of a crappy drawing, but if you can relate that back to the picture that is in your textbook or PowerPoint slides that were provided, you can see in a little more detail, a little more clearly what I tried to get across. All right, so I want to briefly mention the cardiac conduction system, not because we're actually going to go through it, because this is an anatomy class, not physiology, but because I want you to know where the spots are for the cardiac conduction system that are important. All right, so remember the cardiac conduction system. The heart's made of muscle, and in order for that muscle to contract, we need to have the nervous system stimulating it to contract. Uh, well, it turns out the heart kind of has its own little nervous system, all right? Certain groups of cells that will stimulate, that will provide electrical impulses that will stimulate the heart muscle to contract. All right, and what that does is you stimulate the heart muscle to contract, you depolarize it, and then then the muscle contracts, and then you repolarize, and the muscle relaxes. All right, and so taking through all the phases of the cardiac cycle, that's how the cardiac conduction system will work, and that produces your characteristic EKG tracings or ECG tracings. And so we'll discuss that more in physiology. But the important anatomy you need to know is right here, the sinoatrial node, also known as the SA node, and right here, the atrioventricular node, or the AV node. Now, the thing about these is you will never ever see them. Like, you cannot pick these out in gross anatomy. Even in the anatomage table, there's not a spot where you can actually see, oh, this is the SA node. So what I want you to know about it is the SA node is located at the junction of the superior vena cava and the right atrium. So you find the superior vena cava, you find the right atrium, and that's approximately where the SA or sinoatrial node is going to be located. You remember that's the first node of the heart that produces what we refer to as a normal sinus rhythm, hence the sinoatrial node. And when you're looking at the inside of the heart, you'll find the septum, the septal wall between the atrium and ventricle. Let me erase this right here. The septal wall between the atrium and ventricle. At the very top of it, you will see the AV node. All right. Actually, you won't see it again, but that's where the AV node will be located. So, if you have a question that says, what would be in this location that is part of that cardiac conduction system, your answer would be the AV node. If I were to have uh, a pin in a space between the uh, superior vena cava and the right atrium and say, which part of the cardiac conduction system would you find in this location, your answer would be the SA node. Then, of course, you have the AV bundle, also known as the bundle of His, that divides into the left and right bundle branches. And then as you go down towards the apex of the heart, you have little branches coming off that will innervate the actual muscular walls of the ventricles, and those are called the Purkinje fibers. Okay, we will go over that in physiological detail in physiology, but that's the general anatomy of the cardiac conduction system. And again, you won't see any of this in your gross anatomy dissection, but you will be responsible for that material in terms of how the cardiac conduction system works and how that will produce ECG tracings in physiology. You're going to have an entire class in ECG in your second semester, so you should start getting into the habit of knowing it now. There's a really good summary of all of these structures in your bare bones book on page 189. All right, so next we're going to cover the coronary vessels. Remember, the coronary vessels originate in the left and right cusps of the aortic semilunar valve. All right, so when blood enters those openings, it goes into your right coronary artery right here. And of course, the right coronary artery is, remember, the right side of the heart's in the anterior portion of your chest wall, or I'm sorry, your thoracic cavity against the anterior chest wall. And so the right coronary artery will technically be in the front, all right, but going along the right side of the heart. And then the left coronary artery will be coming out of the back side of the heart towards the left ventricle, again, which is situated in the posterior portion of the heart. All right, so you have your left and right coronary arteries. Those are your main arteries coming out, supplying the heart muscle itself with blood. All right, and you don't need to know every single part of the coronary vessels or the coronary arteries here, but you'll see that the coronary artery wraps itself around the anterior part of the right ventricle, between the right ventricle and the right atrium, and then branches come out and supply blood to the right ventricle muscle. All right, and you don't need to know those branches. The left side of the heart, on the other hand, branches into what we call the circumflex artery. All right, circumflex tells you that it's going around and flexing, so it's going around the left ventricle between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And then it's going to head down the anterior interventricular septum between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, right, and then spread out from there. All right, so we call that the anterior interventricular branch of left coronary artery, otherwise known as the left anterior descending artery, or LAD. And this picture right here is just showing you the openings, your aortic sinuses, going into the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery from the superior view of the heart. As far as venous drainage goes of the coronary vessels, or otherwise known as the coronary veins, we have the great cardiac vein right here, and that is going to be draining blood from the apex of the heart up the same route, or following the same path that the LAD follows, and then joining where the circumflex artery is around to the backside of the heart, joining other vessels such as the posterior cardiac vein into what is called the coronary sinus. And notice that this coronary sinus is a relatively large or engorged structure where all of your venous drainage is going to empty into. And then that coronary sinus, of course, we saw earlier, empties into the right atrium, right? And then right atrium to right ventricle, then gets pushed out to the lungs to get reoxygenated. So other vessels to note that are going to be actually, I think, part of your homework, this middle cardiac vein, going directly up to the coronary sinus here, and the small cardiac vein coming from the right side of the heart, emptying into the coronary sinus. So again, keep in mind that the coronary vessels consist of the coronary arteries, which are coming out of those two openings in the aorta associated with the cusps of the aortic semilunar valve, going to the left and right side of the heart, and then the coronary veins pick that blood back up and all dump back into the coronary sinus to complete the circulatory path of the muscle, the myocardium of the heart. For cardiac innervation and lymphatics, we'll do the lymphatics first. And what I want you to notice about the lymphatics is that there are lymphatic vessels right here that drain along the same path as the coronary artery and coronary vein. Veins are located. So you see it here in the right coronary artery, here you see it here in the LAD. So excess fluid that the veins don't return, the lymphatics will pick back up. And they will go through various lymph nodes, and you don't have to know these lymph nodes per se, but they have to travel through the lymph nodes to pick up any kind of foreign material that may have been picked up. A lot of redundancies in the circulatory system, and then pick back up and dump into ducts that empty into the right and left subclavian veins, which then dump into the brachiocephalic veins and to the superior vena cava back into the right atrium, right, to return that excess fluid back to circulation. Right, as far as the innervation goes, innervation, of course, means the nerves that are going to the heart. Remember, the heart has a cardiac conduction system, so it can spontaneously produce its own rhythm, but it needs to have accelerators and brakes on it as well, and that comes from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So here you have, let me get my yellow pen, cardiac nerves from the sympathetic trunk coming down here, all right, going to the superficial cardiac plexus. You have vagal cardiac branches coming here, going to the superficial cardiac plexus. And then you have more vagal branches and nerves from the sympathetic trunk going to the deep cardiac plexus. And notice that the superficial cardiac plexus is right here on the anterior surface of the aortic arch, whereas the deep cardiac plexus is behind the aortic arch here at the on the trachea, where it bifurcates into the left and right primary bronchi at this structure, which we didn't say earlier, is called the carina of the trachea. So that's where you'll find the deep cardiac plexus. And both of these, of course, the sympathetic will accelerate heart rate and accelerate force of contraction, whereas the parasympathetic will slow heart rate, all right, depending on the needs of the body.